The flashing red and blue lights lit up the oak trees like a disco gone wrong. Deputies stormed the gravel driveway, sirens howling, just as a retired state trooper was lifting a slice of brisket to his mouth. The music cut. Every guest froze. A voice barked through a loudspeaker, telling everyone to remain where they were. From across the fence, clutching her little chihuahua and wearing a smug grin, stood Karen. Her fingers still hovered over the call button, convinced she had single-handedly stopped a criminal gathering. What she didn't know was that the criminals were all lawmen and they'd been invited. It all began a few days earlier, when I, Frank Miller, decided to throw one last surprise party for my best friend and partner of over 3 decades, Sheriff Dale Granger. The old man had served this county longer than most folks had been alive. He was the one who talked me down when my daughter wrecked the family truck, the one who stayed with me through 2 divorces, 1 near-death fall off a ridge, and more stakeouts than I could count. So, when he told me he was finally retiring, I knew I had to go all out. We'd fixed up my barn over the past month, hanging string lights and converting old hay racks into tables. My land stretched 10 acres past the HOA line, which was one of the reasons I bought it in the first place. No rules. No meddling. Or so I thought. Karen Harper, my unfortunate neighbor across the narrow ditch and rickety fence, was the self-declared neighborhood watch, moral compass, and nuisance rolled into one. She was the type to measure grass blades with a ruler and call the fire department if she saw smoke from a barbecue. Now, she was convinced that my barn party was an insurrection in disguise. She showed up 3 days before the party, while I was hanging a welcome banner that said, "Congrats, Dale. You're free." She marched right up to the fence in her leopard print slippers, waving a clipboard like it was a sword. I greeted her kindly, as I always tried to, even though she never returned the favor. She pointed at the banner, then at the barn, then at my face. "Did you get approval for this gathering?" I raised an eyebrow. "Approval? I own this land, ma'am. It's not HOA property." She sniffed like something foul had passed under her nose. "Even if it's not technically within our boundary, any major gathering impacts the peace and appearance of our neighborhood. There are cars. There are smells. There are, God forbid, people starve." I offered her a smile and a cup of iced tea, which she ignored. Then she jotted something on her clipboard and spun on her heel. I figured that was the end of it. I figured wrong. Saturday rolled around, and the barn was alive. Smoke from the grills curled into the sky. Kids ran around with toy sheriff hats. Retired officers shared stories, some that made folks laugh, others that made them quiet. My daughter Katie helped set up the dessert table, which included a chocolate cake shaped like a pair of handcuffs. Dale hadn't arrived yet, which gave us time to practice the surprise entrance. Everything was going perfect until Karen made her move. At first, we noticed her lurking behind the fence, binoculars in hand. Someone laughed and said, "I think she's counting us." Then we noticed her speaking into her phone, nodding like she was negotiating a hostage situation. She pointed across the field, gesturing wildly, then turned her phone to show someone what she was seeing. Then came the sirens. 3 patrol cars. Lights flashing. 1 unmarked. The party turned quiet. And somewhere, in the back corner of the barn, a retired U.S. Marshal muttered, "She's gonna feel real dumb in about 5 seconds." A cruiser and a fire truck, for reasons unknown, tore down the dirt road like something out of a movie. I could feel the tension ripple through the crowd. A few of the younger deputies instinctively shifted their hands toward where their holsters would have been back when they were still active. A woman clutched her purse. Someone dropped a plate of ribs. I walked calmly to the edge of the driveway just as the lead deputy stepped out. Officer Jenkins. I hadn't seen him since he finished the academy 3 years ago.
He looked stunned.
"Frank, what the hell's going on?" I smiled and patted his shoulder. "Welcome to Dale's retirement party. You hungry?" He looked over at the crowd, then back at me. "You're kidding."
"Nope."
The other 2 officers climbed out and burst into laughter as they recognized old faces. Hugs, handshakes, shoulder claps. Even the fire crew realized what was happening and turned their truck around. And there, still on her side of the fence, Karen stood stunned. She shouted across the ditch. "This is not a legal gathering. There are weapons. There are uniforms. This is intimidation." The officers chuckled. One leaned against his cruiser and said, "Ma'am, these are retired state troopers and local lawmen. You called the cops on the cop." Karen's face turned from pale to red to furious in a matter of seconds. She screamed about HOA bylaws and community disruptions, but no one was listening anymore. People had gone back to their ribs. The music started up again. The kids resumed their games. And as for Dale, he arrived right as the last siren faded, walking into a party that now had the most unforgettable entrance anyone could imagine. He raised a brow as I handed him a beer. "I didn't plan the law enforcement escort," I said. "That one's courtesy of our neighborhood watch." He looked over at Karen, who was now furiously recording the party with her phone, muttering to herself. He clinked his bottle to mine and said, "This is already better than the medal ceremony." And that was just the beginning. Because Karen wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The next morning brought no peace. While most of us were still nursing coffee and laughing about the chaos from the night before, Karen had already filed 3 formal complaints. One with the HOA, one with the county, and one with a news tip line that claimed to expose rural corruption. She wasn't embarrassed by what happened. She was angry. And when someone like Karen gets embarrassed in front of a crowd, she doesn't walk away. She escalates. I found that out when a neighbor, old Mr. Goodwin from 2 lots down, came by with a concerned look on his face and a printed email in his hand. Karen had sent it to everyone on the HOA mailing list. It was long, full of dramatic capital letters and titled Unsanctioned Military Assembly and Unaccounted Firearms. In the email, Karen claimed our retirement party was actually a covert political rally with unauthorized weapons and unknown personnel in military gear. She insisted I had broken noise ordinances, zoning codes, and created a public safety hazard by hosting it. She even alleged that I had blocked emergency access to the neighborhood by having cars parked along my gravel driveway, which, by the way, is nowhere near her house. She attached pictures, some of guests in tactical vests, one of a grill with smoke rising, and even a blurry one of someone who looked vaguely like a senator. That photo somehow ended up on a local news blog later that day with a caption, *, what's going on at the Miller Ranch? *. I wasn't worried, but I was irritated. Dale and I had been planning that gathering for weeks. Everything was done by the book. We filed the correct notices with the county, invited only friends and family, and had food catered by the local firehouse team. Even Deputy Jenkins, the one who'd first arrived, called later and apologized. He said it looked like a scene from a movie. He wasn't wrong. And Karen? Well, she was just getting started. But there was nothing illegal. Still, Karen wouldn't stop. She started knocking on doors again, trying to rile up neighbors who hadn't even attended. One young couple down the road, new to the area, said she warned them they were living next to extremists. It would have been laughable if it wasn't gaining traction. One HOA board member, a guy named Reed, who always seemed to nod a little too eagerly when Karen talked, called for an emergency discussion about neighborhood safety. He didn't even bother to notify me, even though my property wasn't in the HOA. I heard about it from Katie, who saw the agenda posted in the community Facebook group. They were planning to recommend new buffer guidelines between HOA land and non-member properties. And they were using my party as the justification. That night, I got a knock on my door. It was Dale. He looked irritated, holding a printed-out version of Karen's photo collage. He tossed it on my kitchen table. "She sent these to the local news and to my department," he said. "She says you were housing armed men on your property." I poured him a cup of coffee and sat down across from him. "You mean like you?" I said. He grunted. "She thinks there's some deeper thing going on here." "There is," I replied. "She's got a grudge. Remember her husband?" He paused, then nodded. "Years ago, Karen's husband had trespassed onto my land during deer season, looking for a buck he claimed to have shot. He didn't have a license for that section, and he definitely didn't have permission. Dale and I had found him near my north fence line with a loaded rifle and a cooler full of open beer. We filed the report. He lost his hunting rights for a year and had to pay a hefty fine. Karen never forgave either of us. You think this is all about that? Dale asked. I think it's personal. The party was just an excuse. Dale leaned back, sighing. Then she's playing with fire. The next day, it got worse. A small-town reporter showed up uninvited, microphone and camera crew in tow. Said he was doing a follow-up on public complaints about the event. He wanted to know if I had hosted an unlicensed gathering and whether weapons were present. I laughed and pointed to the sign on my barn. No weapons beyond this point, except laughter. Then I asked him if he wanted a quote. He said yes. I gave it to him straight. It was a retirement party for a man who served this county for 40 years. If having a few ribs and sharing memories is suddenly criminal, then you better arrest every church picnic and family reunion in this state. He left after that. But the fire Karen had lit was spreading. One neighbor called to ask if he needed to be worried about federal agents on the property. Another asked if we were planning to have more events. I kept trying to remind myself not to let it get to me, but it wasn't just about me anymore. Karen had accused a whole group of decorated officers of being something they weren't. She was trying to stir fear. Later that evening, Jenkins showed up again, this time off duty. He came with 2 other deputies who'd retired recently. They brought a big pot of chili and a cooler full of root beer. We thought you might need a little backup, Jenkins said. You know, in case the neighborhood watch comes back. We sat out under the barn lights again, quieter this time, and ate dinner like old friends. The stars were out. The breeze was soft. No music. No drama. Just stories. But I could tell none of us felt quite settled. Karen wasn't done. Not yet. Her next move came quicker than expected. On Monday morning, while I was stacking leftover chairs in the barn and sweeping up bottle caps, I heard the telltale sound of her voice rising on the wind. I looked over and saw her standing just outside her fence line, holding a printed stack of papers like she was passing out flyers for a garage sale. She was shouting across to anyone within earshot, accusing me of destabilizing the neighborhood and demanding an immediate HOA emergency session. A few neighbors gathered nearby, mostly confused. One of them asked her what exactly the danger was, to which she replied with something about government surveillance, secret training camps, and children being endangered by proximity to lawmen. I had to stop myself from laughing. She got her meeting. That evening, the HOA board gathered at the local clubhouse. And though my property wasn't officially under their jurisdiction, that didn't stop them from putting my name at the top of the discussion list. Within their reach or not, I still went, out of sheer curiosity. Katie begged me not to, said it would only feed into Karen's chaos, but I had to see it for myself. The moment I walked into the room, all eyes turned. Karen's were the loudest. She pointed at me, raised her stack of printouts like they were legal documents, and announced that the man who caused all this was here and should be made to answer for it. I raised my hand calmly and asked a simple question. Am I in this HOA? Reed, the board member who usually nodded at everything Karen said, fumbled a little before replying. Technically no, but your proximity to our community has a measurable impact on the environment of... I cut him off. So the answer is no. He went red and nodded. Karen tried to interrupt, launching into a tirade about buffer zones and HOA-adjacent properties, but the crowd was shifting. One neighbor asked why she hadn't simply come over and asked questions instead of calling the police. Another reminded her, loudly, that the HOA didn't have the power to control land it didn't own. It got tense fast. Karen accused half the room of being enablers. Someone recorded it all and posted it to the neighborhood group that night. Within hours, the clip was being shared beyond our town. The part that got the most laughs was when she shouted that drones had been flying over her yard and that she feared surveillance by people in cowboy boots. By the next morning, a local radio show had picked up the clip. They played it back-to-back with audio from the 911 call she had made during the party. She had used the words suspicious, potentially armed, and unknown militia multiple times. The hosts laughed so hard they could barely get through the segment. They nicknamed her Barnstorm Karen and said they were waiting to see if she'd file a lawsuit against barbecue sauce next. While Karen ranted and panicked, I decided to move forward with something productive. A few of the guests at Dale's party were members of a rural response training group that helps small towns improve disaster preparedness. With their encouragement, I applied for a community outreach permit to host monthly seminars in my barn. No politics. Just first aid classes, CPR certifications, fire safety, and self-defense. The county loved the idea. A local nonprofit even offered to fund it. I announced it on the town's bulletin board with a single sentence: learn safety from those who serve. Karen lost her mind. She claimed I was turning my barn into a paramilitary base. When a neighbor's kid flew a drone during one of the planning meetings, she screamed from her porch that we were spying on her and shouted about federal intrusion. That particular outburst happened while I had my trail cameras recording the pasture. One camera, perfectly positioned near a fence post, caught her sneaking across her side and ducking under a wire fence. She was crawling through my back hedgerow with a small camera in one hand and what looked like a notebook in the other. She didn't make it far. She slipped into a muddy drainage ditch and landed face-first in a patch of weeds. Her little notepad floated down the trench like a lost raft. The footage was gold. I didn't post it. I didn't even report her. But at the next community cookout, one of my friends thought it would be funny to project trail cam highlights onto the side of the barn.
People laughed, clapped.
One guy even brought popcorn. Karen's fall got a standing ovation. She didn't attend the cookout, of course. But she definitely heard the cheers echoing across the field. Despite all of this, Karen pushed forward. She contacted a low-tier news station and somehow convinced a reporter to do a segment titled "Neighborhood Tensions Boil Over." I watched it from my phone while sitting on my porch, Dale next to me drinking from his usual tin cup. The reporter interviewed Karen on her lawn. She looked proud and defiant, calling me a destabilizing element and accusing my guests of being operatives. The funniest part was when she claimed her pet chihuahua had developed anxiety from the barn lights. But the real punch came at the end of the segment. The reporter tried to interview Dale. He agreed, but only on one condition: that he got to speak freely. They aired the whole clip. Dale looked straight into the camera and said, "The only anxiety I've seen around here is from people being allergic to common sense." Frank threw a retirement party. We ate ribs and laughed. The only weapons present were butter knives and sarcasm. If that scares you, I suggest therapy. The internet ate it up. The clip got shared hundreds of times. And Karen? She doubled down again. She emailed the mayor, the sheriff, the local school board. She tried to make the argument that I was a threat to the children of the community. When none of that worked, she showed up unannounced at a county zoning office and demanded they investigate my barn. The clerk, who happened to be one of Dale's nieces, politely told her that no investigation was needed. All paperwork was in order. Karen had started a war she didn't understand. And she had no idea the worst part was yet to come. The real trouble started with a letter. It came folded and stuffed in a cheap envelope, left wedged in my mailbox. No stamp, no return address. But the handwriting was unmistakably Karen's. It wasn't a letter so much as a printed threat. Karen claimed she had discovered that a portion of my driveway overlapped an easement granted to the HOA years ago. She insisted that meant my access road technically infringed on community space and demanded I reroute my driveway or face legal consequences. She included a shaky map with hand-drawn lines and a highlighted portion she had marked with 3 question marks and an arrow pointing to the word trespassing. I stared at the paper for a long time, not out of fear, but sheer disbelief. She had crawled through a decade's worth of old zoning documents, scanned plat maps, and dug into dusty filing cabinets to find something, anything, that might give her leverage. But what she didn't realize was that Dale and I had already gone through those same files years ago when I built the barn and poured the new gravel road. The easement she referenced? It had expired. The HOA never renewed it. The land reverted back to me. She was threatening me over nothing. But now it was official. Karen wasn't just a noisy neighbor. She was actively trying to dismantle my life one accusation at a time. And I was done playing nice. Drainage ditch. Accused my grill of being a weapons cache. And now she was trying to evict my gravel driveway. I didn't reply. Instead, I pulled out the real map, official county survey documents, blueprints from when I bought the land, and the deed, which clearly stated the property lines. The easement she referred to did exist, but it had been dissolved 5 years ago when the county rerouted utility access and returned control of the land to me. I owned it. Fully. Clean and clear. In fact, it wasn't just that I owned the driveway. I owned the sliver of road that gave the entire cul-de-sac access to the main street. That piece of land was mine, quietly deeded over as part of an old agricultural preservation agreement. I had never made a fuss about it because I believed in letting neighbors be neighbors. Until now. I called my lawyer just to confirm. She laughed when she saw the documents. Then she got real quiet and said, "Frank, if you wanted to, you could technically block off that access road and force the HOA to negotiate with you." I told her I didn't want to go that far. Not yet. But I wanted a formal cease and desist letter drawn up, citing harassment, trespassing, and public defamation. She agreed and told me to expect a courier within 2 days. I didn't mention it to anyone except Dale, who simply muttered, "She's not going to see it coming." Meanwhile, Karen ramped up her antics. She handed out flyers warning neighbors that I was endangering their safety by holding events in my barn. She wrote to the state agricultural board suggesting I was storing hazardous materials. She even tried to contact the wildlife department to report seeing endangered species near my barbecue pit, implying I might be disturbing their habitat. The departments ignored her, but the neighbors had had enough. One by one, they started showing up on my porch. Some brought cookies. Others just wanted to talk. They were tired of being dragged into Karen's war. A few admitted they'd been afraid to speak up before, but after seeing how she had embarrassed herself on the news and at the HOA meeting, they didn't want her representing them anymore. That week, an unofficial petition started floating around. It was a call for Karen's removal from the HOA board. It needed 30 signatures to trigger a vote. By the weekend, it had over 50. The final straw came when she interrupted a community gardening day by accusing 3 seniors of planting invasive species. One of the women told her she needed Jesus. Another told her she needed better glasses. Karen stormed off, vowing to sue the whole HOA. On the day the vote was scheduled, Karen didn't even show up. She sent a fiery email claiming the vote was illegal, the signatures forged, and the motion itself a result of systemic bias against those who uphold the rules. The board voted anyway. It was unanimous. Karen was removed from her position. Word spread fast. Dale brought over a bottle of sparkling cider, and we toasted on my porch while the sun went down. Then came the fun part. My lawyer arrived with the paperwork I'd requested. The cease and desist letter was clear, professional, and supported by photographic evidence and a detailed log of Karen's harassment. But that wasn't all. She had also drawn up a set of options regarding the land under the HOA road. I could sell it back to the HOA at a fair market rate. Or I could place a private use restriction on it. Or if I wanted to be a bit more creative, I could turn that stretch into a named lane, designate it private, and issue easement permits with my own rules. She called it tactical land stewardship. I called it poetic justice. I didn't block the road. I didn't charge anyone rent. But I did hang a small sign at the start of it. Nothing dramatic, just a hand-carved wooden post that read, "Miller Lane, private access. Welcome to all respectful travelers." Neighbors chuckled when they saw it. Some stopped to take pictures. A few brought their kids just to see the sign and pose with it. It became a small local legend. People understood the message without me saying a word. Karen did too. Of course, she didn't take it well. She stood at the edge of her yard staring at the sign for what felt like hours.
She paced.
She fumed. Then she packed up and left for a few days. No one really knew where she went. When she returned, she was quieter, at least in public. But she did try one final Hail Mary. A new envelope showed up at my door, this time from a different law firm. Inside was a cease and desist of her own. She was demanding that I remove the sign, cancel any future barn events, and publicly apologize for public humiliation and emotional damage caused by the videos and community laughter. She included a request for financial compensation for stress-related medical expenses. I gave the letter to my lawyer. She read it twice and rolled her eyes. Then she drafted a final response. The tone was calm, the content ironclad. It reminded Karen that she had no standing, no legal authority, and no evidence of wrongdoing. It closed with a simple statement. Do not contact our client again in any capacity unless through legal representation. All future communication will be recorded and filed accordingly. ***. We mailed it certified. And just like that, the noise started to fade. But something told me she wasn't finished. Not really. People like Karen don't surrender. They retreat and wait. The following weeks were surprisingly calm. Karen no longer appeared by the fence with her binoculars. No more calls were made to the sheriff. No flyers. No HOA rants. No doorstep warnings about community decline. For a moment, it almost felt like she had finally accepted her loss and moved on. The neighborhood returned to its peaceful rhythm. Neighbors mowed their lawns without measuring the grass. Kids rode their bikes without being scolded for noise. And the barn became what I always meant it to be, a quiet place for folks to gather and learn. We hosted our first emergency training session 2 Saturdays later. 23 people showed up, some retirees, others young couples with kids. Dale ran the first aid portion. I covered the fire safety basics. By the end, even the county commissioner stopped by to shake our hands and thank us. It was a quiet victory, the kind that didn't need headlines. But Karen was never one to lose quietly. One evening, just as the sun was sliding down behind the hills and casting that golden stretch across the pasture, a white SUV rolled slowly up to the edge of my driveway. It didn't pull in. It sat there for a long minute, engine idling, before reversing and leaving. I knew it was her. No one else drove that slow on our road. The next morning, I found another envelope in my mailbox. This one had a different tone. There was no official letterhead, just a handwritten note on lined paper that read, "You think you've won, but people are talking. This isn't over. ***. No signature. No threats. Just that." I didn't show it to Katie. She'd only worry. But I did file it away. That same week, I received an unexpected visitor. A young man in a blazer, holding a clipboard and looking nervous, said he was a representative from a real estate firm out of state. He had a client interested in buying rural land, particularly near HOA developments, and wondered if I'd consider selling. I laughed and asked if this client wore red blazers and had a dog named Muffin. He didn't get the joke. I declined the offer. He left quickly. Later, I found out from a neighbor that Karen had listed her house for sale, citing irreconcilable differences with the surrounding culture. Word was she wanted a gated community with stricter enforcement and no men with barns. Her house went up quietly on a few websites. The listing described it as peaceful, HOA managed, and adjacent to scenic country land. It conveniently left out the part about the barn, the party, or the sheriff's retirement bash. When the listing was shared in our community group, someone added a comment that read, "Come with free evening drama if the barn lights are on." The post got more likes than the house got inquiries. A few days later, Dale and I were sitting on my porch again, same chairs, same tin cups. He stared out at the horizon the way he always did after sunset and said, "You know, if someone told me a year ago we'd still be dealing with this woman after retirement, I'd have laughed in their face." I nodded and poured us each another round of sweet tea. "You think she's really moving?" he asked. "I think she finally realized she can't control everything," I said. "And people like her, once they lose control, they don't stick around. They need fresh ground to stomp on." We sat in silence for a while, watching the fireflies blink around the edge of the fence line. Then I told him what I was planning next. I wanted to turn the barn into more than just a training space. I wanted it to be a community hub, potlucks, movie nights, book swaps. A place where people could come together without worrying about clipboards or bylaws. Dale smiled at that, said it sounded like something this town needed. "You gonna put up another sign?" he asked. "Already working on it," I replied. A week later, we had our first movie night. I borrowed a projector from the local school and used an old bedsheet as a screen. About 30 people showed up. Families brought lawn chairs and blankets. We served popcorn in paper bags and showed an old Western. It felt right, like the town was healing, like we had reclaimed something that had been slowly drained away by rules and fear. And just before the movie started, I stood up and thanked everyone for coming. Then I pointed to the new sign hanging above the barn door, carved in oak. It read, State Trooper Retirement Hall. Asterisk, you can party here. Just don't call Karen. Asterisk. The crowd erupted in laughter. Even the mayor chuckled. A few people took photos. One woman offered to paint it in color. I told her to surprise me. Karen never came back to complain. In fact, a few weeks later, we found out her house had officially sold. She left a few things behind, a wind chime, a broken sprinkler head, and a lot of bad memories. But the town moved on. People planted new trees. Kids started riding past her old yard without looking over their shoulders. Peace, real peace, settled back in like a forgotten friend. We didn't celebrate her leaving. We celebrated each other staying. One morning, as I was walking out to the barn with a mug of coffee in one hand and a bucket of nails in the other, a reporter from the same station that once aired Karen's Meltdown called me. Said he wanted to do a follow-up segment on rural community building. Asked if I'd talk about the party and everything that happened after. I thought about it, then said, no. Let the barn speak for itself. Let the town tell the story in its own quiet way. And maybe, just maybe, someone out there would hear it and remember that sometimes the best revenge is living well, laughing louder, and never letting the angry few dictate the joy of the many.